The falls were a place worthy of fear. The torrent, swollen by the melted snow, plunged into the abyss. Spray rolled up from it like smoke from a burning building. The cauldron of incalculable depth swirled and seethed with foam, brimming and shooting over the lip of the cliffs. The sight turned a man nauseous with its constant whirling and clamour. Sherlock Holmes stood near the chasm's edge, peering down at the gleam of water breaking on the black rocks below. He looked angular, even in a tweed inverse coat and his deerstalker cap. He clutched his single stick with both hands as a chill of fear and uncertainty came over him. The rocky ledge upon which he stood was pounded by the deluge. Across it, a cloaked man moved, seething in anger. It was here at Reichenbach Falls where Sherlock Holmes found himself locked in deadly combat against the Machiavellian mastermind of crime, Professor James Moriarty.
"The game is afoot, as you like to say,"
Moriarty barked.
"and this is our final one."
Sherlock shook his head.
"This is no longer a game, James."
Moriarty's teeth were rotten, his hair slicked back. He wore a finely made suit, and draped over his shoulders was an ulster coat that he wore, much like a cloak, with his arms out of the sleeves. In Moriarty's hand was a weighty cane. Sherlock noticed its decorative brass hyena head. The detective knew from previous experience that Moriarty used this cane to bludgeon to death anyone unfortunate enough to stand in his way. Sherlock had seen his work up close. It was a gruesome sight to behold. The hyena, Sherlock thought, was a fitting animal to represent the relentless nature of Professor James Moriarty's criminal empire. Both taunted and tormented, slowly wearing down their victims until triumph was in their clutches. Moriarty squared off against Sherlock. One misstep here on the slippery rock would certainly mean death. He threw off his ulster coat, which went fluttering over the falls, revealing shoulder holsters, each housing a pistol. Upon seeing the pistols, a look of disdain spread across Sherlock's face.
"A coward to the end,"
Sherlock whispered. Moriarty sprang into action, dropping his cane and cross-drawing his firearms while cocking back the hammers of the pistols with his thumbs. In that moment, Sherlock saw an opening, levelling expert strikes to Moriarty's ribs with his single stick. Moriarty winced in pain. Sherlock raised his single stick again, whacking Moriarty's wrist. The pistol flew out of Moriarty's right hand. Striking the ground, it fired, shattering a stone behind Sherlock's head. Not wanting to be outmatched, Sherlock kicked the pistol over the falls, bringing the fight closer to balance. Sherlock whacked Moriarty's other hand with the single stick, disarming him. The remaining pistol flew behind him. With another quick jab, he struck Moriarty in the jaw, sending him falling to the ground. Moriarty flashed his wicked grin, wiping at the blood running down his chin with his sleeve. He frantically searched the ground, grasping at pebbles until his hands felt the touch of a familiar object, his hyena-headed cane. Moriarty stood to his full height. In a showman-like display, he held out his cane with a hand on each side. He pulled back the brass hyena head, revealing the glimmering blade of the sword concealed within. It was a kalishmard, designed as a middle-aged weapon with a small blade for a nimble attack. In his other hand, Moriarty held the metal sheath. No doubt he intended to use it for defensive blocking. Moriarty swung the metal sheath with full force, trying to strike Sherlock's head and deliver the final blow. Sherlock raised his single stick to deflect the oncoming strike. He wasn't prepared for what happened next. He twisted, trying to avoid Moriarty's sword, but he was too late. The fiend whirled, plunging the blade deep into Holmes's right flank. Holmes' eyes flashed with surprise as he staggered back, holding his wound, looking down as blood seeped into his clothes and spilled out over his hand.
"A fool from the start,"
Moriarty rasped. Sherlock lost his strength, falling to one knee. He tried to stand, but failed to regain his balance. Moriarty recovered the fallen pistol from the ground, his face triumphant as he lifted it.
"The world's greatest detective. Just a man,"
he scoffed. Moriarty pressed the muzzle of the gun to Sherlock's temple, not seeing the detective's teeth grinding, his fists knuckling white.
"Unable to match the monster he uncovers. You've never had the thirst for—"
Doubled over and dripping blood from his side, Sherlock's eyes flashed with a primal rage that pulsed into fury. Holmes roared into action, his fist connected with Moriarty's jaw. Moriarty squeezed the trigger of the pistol. The muzzle of the gun flashed brightly as it fired only inches away from Sherlock's head. The deafening sound rang through Sherlock's ears and into his skull. Holmes struck again. Moriarty's sword went flying to the ground, landing on the rocks. Red flooded into Sherlock's vision. He found his footing, standing to full height. Holmes brutally swung his fists, battering Moriarty back towards the edge. Moriarty scooped up the sheath from the ground just as Sherlock grabbed his single stick and launched into a berserker rage. Moriarty blocked with the sheath of his sword for as long as he could, but as strike after strike rained down upon him, he no longer had the strength to deflect the blows. The metal tip of his cane touched the ground. Holmes, filled with righteous bloodlust, brought his single stick hammering down again and again across the bloodied face of a cowering Moriarty. Moriarty fell to his knees, his face bruised and beaten. Sherlock froze, staring down at his broken enemy, now defenseless.
"Have mercy,"
Moriarty whimpered.
"please."
He looked up, awaiting a reply. Holmes breathed. The primal rage subsided, and he regained his composure. He paused for a second, taking in the wretched creature pleading before him. Sherlock knew Moriarty's pleas were only a performance, another feint from the master of deception. Moriarty erupted into laughter. His entire demeanor changed as though another personality had taken control of his body. Moriarty sputtered blood through a smile of gore-soaked teeth. His eyes burned into Holmes.
"I almost got you there, didn't I?"
His voice sounded like he was ready to both cry and laugh.
"Face it, Sherlock. Your only course of action is to kill me."
A short giggle accompanied his words.
"If you do that, then I've won,"
he finished. Holmes's face was stern and cold, eyes dark in contemplation, his mind lost in calculations. Time seemed to stand still for a moment as he thought. Sherlock glanced down and spotted the brass hyena head of Moriarty's cane lying on the rocks, the symbol of his entire criminal enterprise. Surely no prison could hold this man. He would most certainly escape or command his criminal enterprise from within its walls. Sherlock considered what Moriarty's continued existence would mean for the world. How many people would die if this madman was left unchecked, sacrificed on the altar of this monster's ambitions? Sherlock knew what had to be done.
"After you kill me,"
he started, taking a deep breath,
"I'll live forever."
Moriarty's eyes burned darkly, locking onto Holmes's as if knowing this would be his last words. With a firm push of Sherlock's heel, the villain reeled backwards over the slippery edge of Reichenbach Falls, howling as he plummeted to his death. There was a sickening crack as his body broke across the jagged wet rocks far below. "Sherlock?" A familiar voice called out behind him. Sherlock spun around and saw the face of his friend, John Watson. He could only guess what was flashing through Watson's mind. He had seen everything. Watson's eyes moved to Sherlock's wound. Watson stepped quickly to him. You must have been out of your mind, Sherlock." He ripped off a piece of his shirt. Bunching it up in his hand, he held it out for Holmes. "That's a nasty bit of work he did to you." He took a better look at the wound. "Use this to compress the wound. It should slow the bleeding." He handed Holmes the compress. "We'll get you fixed up properly when we get to the bottom of the falls. Good as new, I promise." Watson paused for a moment. "The heat of the moment is all it was. I saw it on the battlefield many a time." "No, John, I knew what I was doing," Sherlock said. "Nonsense. I'll go to the authorities. I'll tell them you—"
"You'll tell them I'm dead too,"
Sherlock interrupted. Watson chuckled at that. "Imagine their faces if I told them." "Wait, you're serious?" "It's the only move he's left me," Sherlock replied. A look of surprise and disbelief spread across Watson's face. "Sherlock Holmes? Dead?" "Is it much of a lie, John?" Sherlock responded. "Is it?" With that, Sherlock and Watson made their way down the footpath of the falls. "Easy there, old friend," Watson said. "Just take it one step at a time." He steadied Holmes with a hand on his shoulder. Sherlock felt fortunate. For the longest time he had felt unworthy of the unwavering friendship offered by Watson. He still wasn't sure if he deserved all of it. He knew that he was more than indebted to him. But for the first time in a long time, he sighed in relief. With Watson's hand on his shoulder and calm voice in his ears, he felt that the nightmare of his arch-nemesis had finally come to an end. The world's greatest detective, and yet he couldn't even utter a single word of gratitude to the man to which he owed so much. Not one was able to make its way past his lips, and even if he could, he wasn't sure which would be fitting, for they all seemed too little for what he felt. True friendship was a gift, one that Moriarty never experienced. An hour passed. Holmes stared at Moriarty's shattered corpse, his limbs bent at impossible angles, his bones protruding as the waterfall pulled scarlet from his body. Sherlock dragged Moriarty from the water. Reaching down, he checked for a pulse. There was none. His body was cold and lifeless. The evil light had finally left Professor Moriarty's eyes. The monster's dead smile, dull, bloodshot eyes, and broken teeth burned into Sherlock's retinas. Over the next few days, Moriarty's death was confirmed by over a dozen experts. It was no trick or sham. He was truly dead. A month later, Sherlock stood alone over an obsidian gravestone which read, Professor James Moriarty, 1835 to 1891. Sherlock was stunned to feel a sense of grief overpower him. Perhaps it was the wasted potential of such a man. Or maybe, only then, he realized the impact Moriarty had on him, and on his life. The thrill, the adventure, the adrenaline, all lost, buried under layers of dirt. He saw a group move towards a nearby grave. Flipping his collar up, he headed away before he could be seen. 6 months passed. Staging his death had afforded Sherlock a unique opportunity to dismantle Moriarty's vast criminal network. Moriarty surely would have predicted Sherlock's next move, but his confederates in crime could not. Racing footsteps echoed through the damp tunnels of London's sewers. Sherlock's eyes peered out from the shadows. He had traded in his deerstalker hat for a grey, wool herringbone flat cap. A red scarf concealed the lower half of his face, masking his identity, while staving off the offensive smell rising from the sewers. He held a lantern in one hand and a revolver in the other. Sherlock Holmes, Watson, Detective Inspector Lestrade, and 2 of his men all gave chase. For weeks they had been pursuing a member of Moriarty's crime network. They had been hot on the trail, hoping he would lead them to their prize, but so far he had eluded capture. Their quarry quickly turned a corner. Lestrade was gleeful.
It's a dead end. We've got them.
They turned the corner, but their target had seemingly vanished into the putrid air of the sewers. His temper erupted.
Damn it, we had him.
Sherlock spotted a large pile of debris against one of the walls. It was an overturned wagon. Initially, Sherlock thought it might have been left behind when the sewers were completed in 1870, but something was off. This wagon was too well preserved for such a damp environment. When Sherlock tried to move it with his hands, it would not budge. Holding up his lantern, he peered closer and saw an etching of a hyena's head on the wagon's underbelly. Sherlock climbed on top of the upended wagon and inspected the wood. Running his hands along the smooth surface, his fingers found a groove.
There's a door here,
Sherlock stated in a matter-of-fact way. Sherlock put his weight on the wood with his hands and pushed. The door slid back and opened, revealing stairs which led down into the pitch black below. Where would this passage lead? Sherlock's mind raced with possibilities. One by one, Watson, Lestrade, and his men climbed on top of the overturned wagon, joining Sherlock.
Remember what I said earlier.
Sherlock paused, addressing the group. We must be surgical, striking with precision.
Best to keep in mind this is vermin we're hunting.
Detective Inspector Lestrade turned to address his 2 men.
Ignore what he said and drop them before they drop you.
Lestrade's men nodded in agreement. The group moved down the passageway, descending into the darkness. They raised their lanterns, making their way through a long and narrow stone corridor. At the end of the corridor, they could see the light of a room. About to enter, they were met with an eerie calm. The room was full of giant wooden crates. Money and contraband lay on the dimly lit tables, but there was no one to be seen. Sherlock looked around, analyzing the room. Not seeing anyone didn't mean they weren't there. He held up his hand, signaling for the others to wait. Along the floor was a tripwire. Any poor soul triggering it would not be long for this world. Their life instantly extinguished with a flash and a bang. Sherlock signaled to the others while stepping over it. They entered, guns leveled. From across the room they heard pistols cocking. An object sat in the middle of the room on a large crate concealed by a cloth cover. The man they had been chasing appeared from behind a set of stacked crates. He snatched the cloth, pulling it quickly downwards, revealing the Maxim machine gun beneath. The thug grabbed the sides of the gun, which whirled to life, rattling as it fired a storm of bullets in their direction. Sherlock's group leaped behind the nearby crates, taking cover from the onslaught of incoming fire. Detective Inspector Lestrade reached into his satchel, pulling out 3 round iron grenades. Taking out his jet lighter, Lestrade ignited the fuses and then threw them one by one over the crates towards the machine gun. Sherlock and Watson, both on the ground, laid on their elbows and covered their ears, pressing as hard as they could. They trembled from a series of thundering booms and twitched at the corresponding bright flashes. Sherlock peered over the edge of the crate and saw the Maxim machine gun smouldering. Moriarty's thugs must have taken shelter behind the crates as well, for none were in sight. They raised their pistols and a firefight erupted, lighting up the dark chamber. The crooks dropped one by one. Eyes wild, the leader of the gang readied an explosive device and brought it back over his shoulder to launch towards them. Sherlock dropped him in a surgical shot. He and the device fell to the ground amongst the rest of his men. Sherlock and the rest of his party ducked back behind the crates as the device exploded, sending parts of the gang leader flying overhead into the air. Lestrade stood up, observing the room. The floor was like a battlefield scattered with dead bodies. Unperturbed, Lestrade dusted a severed earlobe from the lapel of his jacket.
Checkmate. I said precision.
Sherlock growled at Lestrade.
This was the work of a butcher.
He took a few steps closer to Lestrade. As a former soldier in Afghanistan, Watson knew firsthand that such could be the cost of teamwork in volatile situations where they needed to quickly adapt. "Sometimes a butcher's what's needed," Watson interjected. Watson noted their men were alive and the criminals were no more. Such was the price paid by many a villain. Thank heavens Lestrade was a butcher and not a surgeon, or they'd all be dead. Watson took a flask from inside of his jacket and took a swig. Then he offered it to Sherlock.
"Here, drink this."
Sherlock declined. Then, as he gazed down at Moriarty's fallen soldiers, he was shaken by a violent vision of Moriarty's dead body, smiling up at him with shattered teeth from amongst the other dead bodies. The blood in his veins started rushing uncontrollably. He felt his organs getting colder. He took a look at the flask and nodded.
"On second thought, I'll have that drink."
He grabbed the flask from Watson's hand. Sherlock took a quick sip from the flask and stopped, looking lost. He held it in his hands, examining it for a second, and then raised it, downing the entire contents to calm his nerves and to quiet his rattling head. Watson shot Lestrade a concerned look. Lestrade was already questioning Watson with a similar expression. Sherlock's death was a masterstroke, or so he had thought.